thank you for joining us at 4 o'clock at the end of your school day or college day. Attended the Support for Disabled Students in Higher Education session today. I'm Kelly Self and I'm the Project Coordinator at Hepp, which is Higher Education Progression Partnership. And I've got colleagues with me today from our partner universities. So Alison from the University of Sheffield, Sarah from Sheffield Hallam and Jackie from our Barnsley College. We have also got our student disability champion, Rebecca, who will be talking as well later. Okay, so just as I move on to the next slide, bit about who we are. So we are the Higher Education Progression Partnership, and as that's such a mouthful, we call ourselves Hepp, and we are a jointly funded organisation. So both universities in Sheffield fund us to deliver our programmes, and it's all impartial information and advice and guidance about higher education. So we work in South Yorkshire and North East Derbyshire, so cover schools in the regions of Doncaster, Rotherham, Barnsley, Sheffield and North East Derbyshire. And we're here to encourage more children, young people and adults as well to look into higher education as an option. Okay. So we're just going to move on to what the session is today that we're going to cover over the next sort of 45 minutes. We're going to look at accessibility, so understand that higher education is accessible to disabled students. We're going to look at the terminology because it's slightly different from school or college to a higher education institution. We're going to look at the support that is available at higher education, and then we're going to also look at what DSA is, so that disabled student allowance as well, and then some guidance around providing guidance on supporting disabled students as they consider higher education from your point of view. Okay, I'm now going to pass you over to my colleague who is going to take on the next few slides. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jackie Reaney. I'm the Higher Education Disability Advisor at Barnsley College University Centre. We seem to change our name every year, so apologies if it's not what you think it is, but it's Barnsley College University Centre at the moment. And in that respect, really, it doesn't matter which of us is speaking, because we all do disability work exactly the same in any university or any higher education institution. So that means really that it's transferable between different universities. If your student starts the process with one university disability advisor, when they get to their destination, then everything they've done will be picked up by the university disability advisor there. So what we say reflects every university within the region. So having said that, it's good that I'm starting with the language around disability, because this is where a lot of the confusion sits in the transition between college, FE college, sixth form college, schools into university. A lot changes around the language, and it probably sounds more complex than it is. So first of all, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see SEN, special education needs, additional learning needs. They're the FE terms, they're the school terms, they're the sixth form terms. When you get to university, when your applicant arrives at university, the term will be replaced by disabled students and reasonable adjustments. So there won't be SEN, there won't be special needs. That doesn't mean to say the caseload isn't the same, but we're very protective about the phrase disabled students, because in the Equality Act 2010, sorry to bring in some boring history, but in the Equality Act, there is a strand that includes disability. So if we have that phrase, disabled students, it reminds staff, students, parents that there is legislation protecting the disabled students, and disability just means anyone with a diagnosis of anything that interferes with how they study. So it can refer to someone with concentration issues or anxieties or dyslexia, but it's anyone with a diagnosis of something that interferes with how they study. So that's maybe the biggest notion to get your head around the phrase disabled students. I've known students get into university and spend 2 years looking for additional learning support, only to find, well, it's there all along, but it's called disability, and they've missed it. They've not managed to make contact. So that's something that you need to head up with. Disabled students instead of SEN special needs students. And SENCOs on the left become in a university a disability advisor or a disability coordinator. And the SEN team on the left of the screen, learning support, becomes the disability service. And that might be within an inclusion service or a student service or a wellbeing service. You might just have to hunt around to find where it sits, but it will be called a disability service or a disability team. Perhaps one of the biggest differences on the left, we've got a learner doesn't need a full diagnosis in order to receive support in FE or in school. That changes when you get to university. You do need diagnostic evidence. So your student applicant will need medical evidence of anxiety, medical evidence of a physical health issue, medical evidence of epilepsy, a diagnostic evidence from an educational psychologist of dyslexia. That's not us being picky. That's not universities being extra scrupulous. It's that Student Finance England hold the purse strings, and they're going to invest an awful lot of money in every student. So they require that the evidence is really strong about a disability issue. And I think now, as your learners are starting to think about next year, putting together applications for DSA, you need to be reminding them perhaps that they will need diagnostic evidence or they will need some sound medical evidence. Otherwise, it won't get past the first gate post in that application. And that application is for disabled students allowance. On the line below, disabled students allowance. That kind of, I wouldn't say it replaces the EHCP, but it builds on what you know as the Educational Health and Care Plan. So although educational health and care plans don't hold weight under that phrase within universities, they become what we know as a disabled students allowance, or what we put together as a reasonable adjustment plan. We call them at Barnsley reasonable adjustment plans, some call them learning contracts, but the EHCP won't exist in that format. Having said that, this is where it might sound a bit like conflicting evidence, but the EHCP does stand as evidence of autism or autistic spectrum syndrome. It doesn't stand as evidence for anything else. If an EHCP states James has autism and dyslexia and ADHD and anxiety, Student Finance England will respond with, we'll accept James's autism evidence, but we will need alternative and further evidence of dyslexia, of anxiety, and of epilepsy or whatever. So, strangely, it's acceptable as autistic evidence, and we can use that in the application stage, but it isn't acceptable for any other evidences, and we'd be advising the applicant of how to chase up some medical information evidence. Next one, please, Kelly. So higher education disability service is us. Every university, every HEI has one. It might be, in Barnsley, it's me, it's one person. In bigger universities, it will be a team of maybe 4, 5 or 6 people. But these are the people you must make contact with as your applicant moves into the new university. Point 2 on there, equal access. That doesn't just mean we work on making sure students can get through the doors or making sure they can get up the stairs. It means access in terms of what each student needs to get comfortably through the course. And that might be extra time for assignments, that might be extra time in exams, that might mean specific software on the laptops, it might mean a comfortable place to do their academic work. So equal access actually means how that student is going to progress through the course at university. And our focus as a disability team is always to work at improving that journey for each of our students as they come in. Personalised support, this is what we do. We tailor the support to meet the needs as identified by the evidence of each student. And of course, we'll build on to what support they've had before and what they tell us about previous learning experiences. Confidentiality is, again, it's really important to us. It's really important nationally that we offer a confidential service with secure information sharing. But actually, what it's important to remember is that means that we won't be speaking to our learners' parents once they're in the university. So we'll discuss with the family over the summer. So I will be meeting with mum and dad and student and answering as many questions to make them feel really comfortable with the service up to the point of entry. And then entry into university as an 18-year-old means that all of that conversation with the family stops. It also means that we don't approach a student's school or the sixth form for information about previous support. Information comes from the student alone. So the applicant needs to be well versed in contacting disability teams and in expressing the kind of support they feel they need or what they've had before, and comfortable with that whole experience, because we won't be drawing that information from anywhere else. A line is drawn under the FE support, under the sixth form experience, and it all starts again confidentially based on our one-to-one information sharing with the student. And the last one on that sheet is early contact. We encourage students to make early contact. By that, we don't mean at the start of term in September. I mean by early contact from March, when the paperwork comes out for making that application for DSA. We can start immediately to put that package of support together. It'll sit on a cloud after we put it together, and it'll be decided and delivered upon when the student arrives at their destination university. But it's important that we start early on, before any entry, to put that support together. Those students who wait until the start of term will find in September that it could take 2 months. It could be December before the support is in place, and that's just because of the numbers involved with student finance. So early contact really does mean before the summer, over the summer, right up until the point of entry. Next one, please. And disability coordinators, that's us, or advisors, that's the role we do, a dedicated point of contact. Students should enter their destination university knowing who they should contact about the support they're heading for. We provide ongoing advice and guidance, so we're not just there to get them through the process before they start, we're there to be available during their course. So where an applicant or where a student comes to us and says, well, actually, I didn't realise, but I will need a taxi to get to that other campus, then we can shape that support around how it's changed for them. So it's not just about arranging support before they enter, it's about being responsive to needs as they arise during the course. Reviews previous support, this is where we would look at what your applicant brings us from school or college, and we'd say, well, you've had this at school, we might look at putting something like that in place now. But remember, we don't chase it up, the applicant has to bring that to us. We can only work with what the student presents us with. So we also identify appropriate university support. This is going back to what I would call our reasonable adjustment plan. Our reasonable adjustment plan, our RAP, is where we advise your students' tutors of what they would need to look at in terms of making the course more accessible and more flexible. So we identify the support that the university must put in place to help that student on their journey through. And the last bit on that page, we guide through the DSA process. And I might think the DSA process is really logical. All of us might think that it's really logical and straightforward, but actually when you don't know anything about the structure of that, how long it takes, what you might be asked, you need to have someone who can guide you step by step through that process and advise you of what to say, maybe what to say and what not to say in certain situations. So that's disclosure. Yeah, that's that one. Next one, please. Sharing disability information on the UCAS form. This is really important because at this stage, it's where our students are completing their UCAS forms for next year round. So our level 3ers are completing their UCAS forms. So I'm already being contacted by parents asking what is university about in terms of delivering support to our learners. And the easiest and most efficient, effective way for your students to make contact with us is by at the point where they're filling in the UCAS form, to fill in that section on the front sheet which invites them to disclose a disability. I know people often get frightened about disclosing a disability or a health issue or a mental health issue, but that form isn't going anywhere else other than to hit the desk of the disability team, and it's the red flag to us to make contact with that applicant and to say, shall we have a discussion about what this means to you as you study? It's entirely confidential, but it flags something up to us that we would not get to know otherwise. So if your applicant doesn't tell us, doesn't tick on the UCAS form, then it could be several months before we find out that student has a disability or a health issue. So that leads back into the final bit, importance of disclosure. If that applicant doesn't share the disability information at their earliest opportunity with us, then we don't know that they're eligible for support. You know, I've known students say to me, you must know it was on my records at school, but we don't have access to that. Our point of understanding your support needs are at the point of you disclosing to us, your students disclosing to us only. We don't know your students are eligible for support unless they tell us that face to face. I'm sorry that it's quite a lot of information to get through all at once, but Alison's now going to pick through that a little bit more carefully to give you the specifics on it. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, so just to say first of all, so yes, I'm Alison and I'm the Disability Transition Officer, and I'm based in the Disability and Dyslexia Support Service at Sheffield University. So in terms of who can access support, so Jackie's already given us a bit of information about that in terms of, so we apply the Equality Act definition of disability. So basically any student who has a long-term impairment or condition that significantly impacts on day-to-day life, and that includes day-to-day life at university. So it's important to note that some students can be eligible for support even if they don't identify as being disabled, because the definition of disability is a lot broader than a lot of students might realise. So we've put together a list here. So that can include students who have a specific learning difficulty, learning difference such as dyslexia or dyspraxia, students with a long-term mental health condition, students with health conditions, long-standing illnesses. So some examples include epilepsy, diabetes, cancer, chronic fatigue syndrome. Students who are autistic, have ADHD, students with physical impairments or mobility difficulties, students with sensory impairments, and anybody whose speech, language or communication is affected and will impact on university life. So that obviously as well includes students with multiple diagnoses. So quite basically, if a student has accessed support in previous education, it's quite likely that they'll be eligible for support at university, or if they think they should have been eligible for support in previous education, but for whatever reason haven't been able to access support. But yeah, we encourage all applicants to get in touch if they're not sure, and to find out if they will actually be able to access support. Okay, thanks, Kelly. Okay, so thinking about, so we've talked quite a bit about who might be eligible for support, sharing information, who gets involved with setting up support, and now we're going to give some information about what support might actually look like at university. So support means providing the necessary study strategies to help the student overcome potential barriers in their studies and to reach their full potential. So it's all about thinking about what can we do to try and ensure that students have equal access, fair access to their studies. And part of the conversation that we will have with students is thinking about what potential barriers there might be on their course, what challenges, and then matching that with the support that's available. So type of support very much depends upon a student's specific needs. So that's why it's crucial that a student is in contact with the University Disability Service, because there needs to be some contact, there needs to be a discussion about support. So we don't put support in place automatically based on, for example, if an applicant contacts us and says, you know, I have a specific learning difficulty, what can you put in place? That's not enough. We need to have a chat with that student to find out what their experience is of having a specific learning difficulty. Some support might vary depending on the course that a student's accessing. So there might be differences around exam support in terms of what recommendations are possible, for example. And there will be some differences between different institutions. So not all higher education institutions will have exactly the same support available. So there will be differences in terms of the inclusive learning that's available within a university, and also in terms of what individual reasonable adjustments they might be able to put in place. In terms of DSA, that generally you should be able to, a student should be able to apply for DSA, and in terms of what's recommended, that should be able to go with them to whichever university they go to, with some differences depending on suppliers, for example, based in their local area. But in terms of types of support that an actual University Disability Service can provide, there might be some differences. So it's really important if a student, for example, wants to know about a certain support, if it's really important that they have access to a certain type of support, then it's really important that they do their research, because there are differences. So I always explain when I'm chatting with potential applicants or applicants that there's kind of two routes to accessing support at university in order to access the full package of support. So some of the support is put in place by the institution's disability service, and some of the support comes through DSA. So generally where funding is required, where there's a cost attached to a certain type of support, that's likely to come through DSA. And then institution adjustments, things like exam support, for example, that is put in place by the University Disability Service. So I always encourage eligible students to apply for both and make use of both, so university support and DSA support. So depending on individual needs, the support might include some of these things on the next slide. Okay, so we've put together a list. Now, some of these, we haven't separated it out in terms of this would be put in place by the Disability Service, this would come through DSA, but I'll just mention that as I go along. So exam adjustments. Now, this is often the kind of initial reason why an applicant or student would have contact with us, is to put in place their exam support, because that's one of the types of support that they've been most used to having in previous education. In terms of what that might look like, again, it's dependent on the individual. So it might be extra time, as well as things like being able to use a computer to type exams, having rest periods, nutrition breaks. There might be adjustments around the exam environment, so it might mean sitting exams with fewer students, for example, to reduce distractions, things like that. Again, like Jackie said, that's in terms of exam adjustments, that's something where we would be asking in that initial appointment or contact with a student what exam support they've had in place previously. Did that meet their needs? Were there other things that ideally they would have had access to? And we might be able to, there might be a bit more flexibility at university in terms of what we can put in place, because it has to be justified. There has to be a disability related justification to put in place that exam support, but we might not have some of the same restrictions that sixth form or college have had in terms of needing to evidence their access arrangements. Learning support plan, or as Jackie said, it's called a reasonable adjustment plan in her university. But basically what that is there will be a way that the Disability Service can communicate with a student's academic department. And the purpose of that is to provide some information about the student, explain what some of the barriers might be potentially on their course, what some of the challenges might be. But the key thing that we're doing there is we are advising departments on how they can support a student on their course. So we're advising on specific reasonable adjustments. So that could be things like it might relate to prioritised reading lists. So a student can ask a department about what's essential reading and what they can do if they really need to. It might be about providing them with the lecture notes in advance of a teaching session, for example, to help them with proofreading, or to support them to have some context to help them to follow the lecture, for example. So that's a really useful document. Face-to-face support to help with managing studies or to work on study skills. So for example, that could be specialist study skills support for a student with ADHD or who's autistic or has a specific learning difficulty, for example. Or it might be specialist mentor support to help to support a student, again, who's autistic or has a ADHD, for example. And that's practical support to focus on time management, organisation, task planning, for example. So the face-to-face support, that would generally come through disabled student allowances, because it's a support where there's a cost attached to it, where it requires funding. Support workers to help students to access classes. In terms of support workers, some things can be funded by DSA. So for example, the study skills, the specialist mentoring, but some support work has to be funded by the university if a student needs it. So again, that's why it's important to have that conversation with the disability service as well as applying for DSA. So there's different type of support work. So lab support, library support worker, practical support in terms of orientation support, familiarisation support. Again, there will be differences across institutions. Some universities have a referral process for diagnostic assessments for specific learning difficulty. Again, not all universities have that, but some do. So if a student arrives at university and they have evidence of access arrangements from previous education, but not a full diagnostic assessment for a specific learning difficulty, then the university might be able to put in place some temporary support, depending on that university's process, but they might then be able to refer for a full diagnostic assessment. Some universities can provide funding for that, some provide full funding, part funding. For others, it might be means tested, or there might not be access to funding for that. In terms of specifically DSA type support, so it can help with the cost of travel to and from higher education. So for example, if a student needs access to a taxi account, if there are barriers to travelling into university through public transport or other means, and it needs to be via taxi, then that can be funded through DSA. Specialist equipment, so whether that's software to support students to produce their written work, a laptop, or ergonomic study equipment. So again, that would be assessed, the need for that through DSA. And then, as I said, certain types of support workers can be funded through DSA if there's a reason for the student to have that in place. Next slide, Kelly, please. Okay, so in terms of how to set up higher education disability support, so that's specifically support through the disability service. So Jackie's already said about the importance of completing the disability section on the UCAS form. All that does is enable the disability service to receive information about the student, about the applicant, so that we can then make direct contact with the applicant to explain the steps that they will need to take to set up support. So that's really useful information. If for whatever reason, if an applicant didn't complete that section on the UCAS form, so sometimes I'll be in contact with applicants and they might not have received their diagnosis at the point of completing their UCAS, so they didn't provide that information on their form. It's fine to then have direct contact with the disability service, just so that they can get into the system and receive the information that they need. So like Jackie said, we will need diagnostic evidence. Even if it's incomplete, even if an applicant isn't sure if it's what we need, we would still encourage applicants to send in what they've got, use it to apply for the DSA. If it isn't what we need, if it's not sufficient, then we can advise on that. And we can also advise on how to obtain additional evidence. And then having contact with a disability advisor to discuss action support. So like I said, support isn't put in place automatically on receipt of receiving evidence. We need to have a conversation. We need to have some contact with the applicant to work out what should actually be in place that will best meet their needs at university. And like Jackie said, information isn't requested or collected from schools. So it is the responsibility of the applicant to provide us with that information. So there's a real kind of move towards that kind of self-advocacy at university and providing information. But we'll do that in a very supported, structured way, because we know that, you know, obviously in previous education, it might be that parents, carers, supported have provided quite a lot of scaffolding support around that. So it can be a real shift to that kind of self-advocacy approach for some applicants. Is that my last slide? Yes. Okay, thank you. Right, I'll hand over to Sarah from Sheffield Hallam.
Oh, thanks, Alison. So my name's Sarah Lamb. I'm a disability advisor at Sheffield Hallam University, and in a previous role, I was a needs assessor for disabled students allowance. So just to give you a bit more information about disabled students allowance. So it's a government funded allowance, and like Alison said, that covers the cost of specialist support, such as support workers, equipment, software, and then there's also a general allowance that can cover photocopying, ink and paper, and a taxi allowance if that's needed based on the disability. So that's not available to all students, it's dependent. And in terms of that support, it's non-means tested, so it's not a loan and doesn't need to be repaid, and you apply through the same process of applying for Student Finance England funding. The best thing to do really is, as Jackie and Alison said, is that there's three areas of support really. There's the university's kind of like inclusive offer, which relates to the reasonable adjustments the university's already got in place, then which comes as a result of the Equality Act. Then you've got the support through the University Disability Services, and then you've got Disabled Students Allowance. Now, some students might only need one of these, some might need all three. So that's why it's really important that you get in contact with the teams so we can help you with that process. In terms of eligibility, most UK students who pay home fees will be eligible and who have got diagnostic evidence, and that can be a letter from your GP if it's related to mental health or a medical condition or autism. It might be a diagnostic assessment for a specific learning difficulty. So that's the eligibility. The courses that aren't eligible are access courses and apprenticeships. So, but still get in contact with the disability service, because there is other means of supporting you through that. So like I said, yeah, you don't need to pay it back, and it doesn't impact on your benefits. So it won't affect any family benefits. And next slide, please, Kelly. Thank you. So to apply for Disabled Students Allowance, you do that through Student Finance England, and normally I think Jackie said it comes through in about March, April time that you can apply for your student funding. So when you do the key bit for your tuition fees and your maintenance loan, you can also apply for DSA. And at that stage, I did it with a student today. They'd already applied for their student loan and maintenance loan, so we just submitted we uploaded her evidence, so you can do all that electronically. And just to note, SFE do acknowledge, as do the universities, that at the moment there's a real delay in getting a diagnosis for autism or ADHD. So students can apply for DSA by providing evidence of a working diagnosis. So once they're on that waiting list, that classes as a diagnosis. So that can be really helpful and relieve some of the pressure if they've been struggling to get a diagnosis. Now, the study needs assessment is a one-to-one meeting between the student and a needs assessor. They will have a disability background and will talk to you about the types of support that are available through disabled students allowance. So it's really looking at the impact that the disability has on a student's ability to study, and then looking at different support options. And this is a two-way process. So if a student thinks, well, I really don't like that as a method of support, then we encourage students to say, so that they can get something that will work for them. And then following that, a long report gets written justifying all the recommendations, and that goes off to the funding body. And then following that, a letter will be emailed to the student explaining how to access the support. Now, the key bit is to really think that this process does take quite a long time. And like Jackie said, to us it might seem quite straightforward, but when you're in the midst of it, and it's not like having an educational healthcare plan, it's not like getting support through school or college, use your disability advisor to support you through the process. They can really help you with that. They know it inside and out, and they know the regulations inside and out, so they can help you. So you start the process by submitting your evidence to Student Finance England, and then you will be referred on to a needs assessment centre, and the needs assessment centre will contact you directly. This is new this year, to arrange an appointment. If at this point you don't know which university you're going to, it doesn't matter, because the majority of your needs will remain very similar regardless of which university you go to, because it's an individual set of support for you. This can then be tweaked, like Alison mentioned, in terms of the suppliers later in the process. But the key bit is to get involved in this process because it takes so long. And the idea is that if you can have your equipment arriving just before you start university and the support's in place, then it gives you the best opportunity to start. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is just a little bit of a checklist. So the key bit is to encourage disclosure on UCAS, and this kind of like triggers automatic contact from the disability services, and they will also provide you with support for disabled students allowance. Access required disability evidence, and there's a link here, and you'll be getting these slides afterwards about how to provide evidence. And again, depending on which institution you go to, contact your disability advisor. They'd be more than happy to help. And then attend relevant transition events, talk to people, find things out, ask on your course, ask your tutors to support you. And at this point as well, if a student requires accommodation adjustments, so that might be because of a medical condition they need to have ensuite accommodation, it might be to have an accessible flat on the first floor, whatever, then that's also worth contacting the university about. Preparation for independent living and self-advocacy. This, I think, is probably the biggest leap for a lot of students. They think the education side is going to be hard, but they also need to be prepared for independent living, and for kind of planning and managing their own time. And there's lots of resources out there. UCAS is a great website, and they have videos about preparing and also about applying for funding. Also, if students come through clearing, we'd ask you to encourage them to contact the disability services, because obviously time's quite short there and we want to get support in place as quickly as possible. So yeah, the key bit to remember really is disclose. If students don't disclose at UCAS, maybe that's because they've not got a diagnosis, or they have a medical condition that develops, or a mental health difficulty that worsens when they're at university, they can still contact the university once their course has started. So it's not, it would be brilliant if all students applied at the beginning and well before and in good time, but that doesn't always happen because of circumstance. So yeah, they can contact at different stages, and we can also review support if things change as well. So that's it from me. I'm now going to hand you over to Rebecca, She's a third-year student at the University of Sheffield, and she's in the process of going through the DSA application stage and has got a needs assessment booked for December. So I'll pass you over to Rebecca now. Thank you.
Thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Rebecca. I'm in my third year doing English Language and Linguistics at the Uni of Sheffield, and I love it. So for a little bit of context, I'm originally from Doncaster, and I was diagnosed with autism in July, and then for the year before that I was operating under a working diagnosis. So the Disability and Dyslexia Support Service have been amazing with their support for me. So the first bit of support I have with the DDSS is my exam adjustments. So for me, having gone through school and college undiagnosed, I've just noticed a massive difference in my experience with sitting exams now. So for me, getting 25% extra time means that I actually have the capacity to properly like decipher and process the questions. And being able to sit my exams in a smaller room means that I'm not overstimulated by constant background noise or footsteps. And not being in that massive exam hall has made my exams just a lot less stressful logistically. I also, as mentioned, have a learning support plan in place. So this is sent to all of my teaching staff with my consent at the start of each term. So I worked with my disability advisor to construct this document. Essentially what it does is it outlines my autistic traits and how they may be exhibited in various settings, such as lectures and seminars. So my lecturers can then understand things like why I struggle to maintain eye contact, why I might fidget and stim, why I might inadvertently interrupt, and why I might need some more support with navigating group projects. I found that my lecturers have received this really well, and they tend to get in contact with me to discuss my needs at the start of each semester, just to make sure they know exactly how to support me. With regards to disabled students allowance, that is something that I'm currently in the process of applying for, given my recent diagnosis. So as stated, you kind of apply through student finance, and then you fill your form in, you book your needs assessment. So I'm having mine in a couple of weeks' time. So the main thing that I'd say is I strongly suggest that students should be encouraged to access all of the support available to them. So in my own experience, when I've essentially presented as a neurotypical person or been seen that way for most of my education and only received support for the past year, having that support network, having those adjustments and plans in place has made the world of difference to me and how much that I can access and enjoy my experience on my degree. The entire process of setting up that support is very collaborative, and we're treated like adults throughout. It's also quite a discreet process as well, with confidentiality, and things aren't particularly like massively publicized, like in terms of confidentiality side of things, if students are kind of worried about that. Because initially, like I was a little bit skeptical, being sort of a 19-year-old initially getting my diagnosis, about like what it would feel like potentially to be sort of seen as disabled at university. But one big thing to note is there's such a substantial proportion of our student body that does receive support from the DDSS and has disclosed disabilities. The biggest piece of advice that I tend to give when I'm working at like open days is just to get those support networks established in good time. Like as was said, like applying for your student finance in March, getting in contact and disclosing, because life can be plain sailing for weeks on end and be really straightforward. But when things get difficult, it is so helpful, and you thank yourself so much for having people and strategies and plans in place so that you can get yourself through the more difficult periods.
Thank you, Rebecca, and talking about your experience there, that's amazing. I'm glad that things have worked out well for you and now you're getting that, so that's amazing. So thank you very much. So I'm now going to go just on to the last bit of the session before we go on to some questions, is just a bit about ourselves in terms of our resources that we have. So we do have a website, which is our Hepp Hub, and on there is all of these valuable online resources. This is our newly rebranded and updated resource, which we call Here For You. And this is all about information that helps students who do have a disability, and it offers lots of information, but also it has got lots of quotes and blogs and things from quotes from students. Also send them out to schools. We have sent them out, so there should be some around schools and colleges, but if you haven't received one or you'd like one in your offices, please just get in touch with us. You can download it if that's easier, but we can also send you out a copy of it. We have everybody at open days being able to access them as well. So these aren't just resources. We have other resources on there as well for other cohorts, as well as parents and carers too. So there are a lot of information that you can get that support from. So that's where we get from all of our information. So we are now at the end of our session. So all of our contact details. So these are, please just get in touch with any of us should you have any questions with regards to DSA or support. So this is just to say thank you so much for joining us again. And as I say, just let us know if you want any further information. But thank you so much for joining us.